Welcome to a world of darkness and terrifying secrets. I'm Cries from the Unknown. And we're back together with Cries from the Unknown. To our longtime friends, thank you for always being part of our horrifying journey. Your support is what drives us to explore more mystery and terror. And if you're new here, you're in for an unforgettable ride. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell because we promise you more stories that will make your heart race. Today, we're taking you on a journey to places many dare not visit, places haunted by unexplained voices and shadows that only appear in the darkest moments. Are you ready to hear the cries from the unknown? If you have your own experiences, share them in the comments. Now, dim the lights, brace yourselves, and get ready to face true horror. My dog keeps waking me up at night, but my dog died 2 months ago. My dog keeps waking me up at night, but my dog died 2 months ago. I remember when it all started to happen, the nightmares, the sweating, the scratching, all of it. Each night the same thing happened over and over again. Why did this happen to me? What the hell did I do to deserve this? About a month ago my dog Apollo passed away and it nearly broke me. I know it may seem over the top, but he was my only family and my best friend. 12 years before I got him my mom died and not long after my dad joined her. Life had been rough and I needed anyone to help cope with the amount of emotions rushing through my body, and that's when Apollo came into my life. He was my angel, a blessing, and most importantly someone to listen to me. He always seemed to sit and take in everything I ever said and I never complained. He was my best friend. Anywhere I went he came, and in return to listening to me I gave him the world, but no matter how much I gave nothing could take more than life. If there is one thing I've learned in my life it is that the more you enjoy the things in life, the more life enjoys watching you suffer as it rips away what you hold closest. Walking into the living room to see the corpse of Apollo might have been one of the hardest sights to see. After all the crying I finally managed to grab a shovel and bury him in my backyard. Each puncture into the ground hurt, but not as bad as each time I covered his limp body until there was nothing but earth below me. It took about a week for me to finally get back to a somewhat normal lifestyle, but the burden of my parents and my dog put a heavy weight on my shoulders. Everywhere I walked felt like I was carrying a life full of anguish and dread. The world no longer had color and my soul no longer had life. I was done. I still functioned as a normal human would, but it got hard and slow with each waking morning. Every other night I would have dreams of me playing with Apollo and my parents watching. A big smile protruded on my face as I was in paradise, and for a moment I could swear that it was all real, but then I would wake up. This ever-going cycle of dreams went on and on with the same schedule: go to sleep, be in paradise, wake up to a nightmare. Sometimes I would wake up and swear I could hear the laughter of my parents with the faint bark of Apollo, but then nothing but silence. That wasn't #039T until a month after these dreams that I noticed that the silence was beginning to break. One night after the dreams I sat up in my bed and looked at the clock to see it was around 3:30 a.m. The blur of my once solidified eyes made it hard to see my surroundings, and the humming of the fan above reminded me of where I was. I felt alone within the dark void of my bedroom and reflected on the false memories I just lived in my head. I glanced around my room to nothing but darkness staring back at me and laid my head back on my pillow hoping to revisit what I was taken away from. The silence of the night began to take me away when I heard something that went through the silence like a boat slicing through the waves. I heard a faint chuff from what seemed to be in my hallway. The door was closed so it was hard to make out anything that faint, but I had sworn that I heard it. I shot open my eyes and stayed still waiting to catch the noise again. A minute passed and then I heard the quiet shuffling of something moving down my hallway closer to the door. It was slow but sounded as if it was creeping. The occasional tap of something that sounded similar to a nail of some animal hitting the hardwood floor echoed into my room. I listened with laser focus when once again I heard a chuff, this time to the left frame of the door. It sounded identical to a dog, but how could a dog have gotten into my house? The doggy door I had bought was programmed to only open to Apollo. A chip in his collar activated the door to open, but I had left the collar in the grave with him. Thoughts flooded my head as I waited for another noise to come from the other side of the door. Sleep was never an option, and I never got tired as the thoughts acted as caffeine. I wanted to say it was a dream and that I would wake up, but the reality was that I was wide awake, and most importantly I was not alone. For hours I stayed awake until I could see slight rays of sun looking through my curtains. I decided to get up out of my bed and get ready as my feet rested on the floor beside my bed. As the hours had passed through the night, my worries had lessened as no other noises were made. Though I could not go to sleep, still I tried to be realistic, as this had not been the first time I heard noises just from my head. Just as I had heard what seemed to be Apollo and my parents each time I woke up, this was no different. Standing up from my bed, I began to walk to the door when I froze from pure fear. About 2 steps in, I heard a loud yelp followed by frantic scattering down my hallway. Whatever the hell I had heard was there all night. My body burned as I could practically feel the blood coursing through my body with rapid speed. The realization hit me hard, and I didn't and #039 dare move for what seemed to be an hour. What kind of creature would have simply sat in the same position all night doing God knows what? I finally built the courage to open my door to nothing but an empty hallway. Just as I began to walk down, my foot was met with a wet puddle. In disgust, I stepped back and looked at what seemed to be a water bottle worth of slobber. Everything in my right mind was telling me that some sort of dog had gotten in and was lost, but I just couldn't see how it could be possible. In need of more answers, I walked further down and everything was normal. Making sure to look over everything multiple times, nothing was out of place and the doggy door looked just as it had always been. I wanted to say that it was all in my head, but the slobber was there and it was very real. I figured that the best way to get past the night was to go through my day, and maybe whatever it was had just gotten lost and was now back home. Everything went as normal throughout the day, and I slowly began to forget about the events of last night. The thought of my family always seemed to help take my mind off of any situation. As the night approached, I turned off the TV and made sure that everything was locked. Once I was satisfied, I did my nightly routine, and before I knew it I was fast asleep. Hours must have passed before I jolted out of my bed to the echoing of a howl. A deep howl that vibrated my insides and lasted for at least 3 seconds. The once normal day turned back into the nightmare I had gone through the night before in mere seconds. My eyes darted to the door as a terrifying realization came over me: the door was still open. The exhaustion from my day and the sleep that had been taken from me took a toll on my mind, and before I had the chance to close the door to my room I passed out. Now I sat there looking at the crack that kept me safe from whatever the hell was in my house. Seconds that felt like hours passed, and I could feel the arms holding me up begin to tremble like the foundations of a building during an earthquake. My body began heavy, but I knew that any movement or sound could draw whatever howled closer to me. Just as the night before, I heard something scruffle around in the living room with the occasional chuff as I heard before. It was loud, very loud, and I could hear the table in the middle of the living room being pushed with cups shaking on top. Once again it howled with the same intensity and would pause, then begin to walk again. With all the courage I had, I quietly stood up and crept to the door with caution. I made it to the doorframe, scared to look around, but I had to get this thing out of my house. Everything pointed to it being a dog, which meant I needed to be careful, especially if it was a stray or a bigger dog that could attack me. With my heart pounding, I slowly looked around the frame to the dark hallway which led to the lightly illuminated living room. The carpet seemed to have been moved around, and the table was now turned at an angle from the creature moving around. With a shiver running down my spine, I slowly walked down the hallway and could hear a slight painting from the right side of the room. In an instant of being 4 feet from where the hallway opened up to the living room, a stench hit me so hard it made me gag. It smelt of rotten meat mixed with vomit and feces blended into a hellbent fragrance. I stood against the wall for a second, having to take in the intense smells, when the beeping of the dog feeder alerted my attention back to the room in front of me. Memories flooded in as I hadn't heard that sound in the 2 months of Apollo not being around. I remember being fascinated with the technology of his collar as the worker at the pet store explained how the chip in the collar could activate the doggy door and the food dispenser when needed. Then the reality hit me, how could this thing possibly have that chip? The only explanation was that Apollo dug himself out of the grave and crawled back into the house for one last visit, but this wasn't reality and certainly was the last possible explanation. This thing could have dug up the collar, but no animal could be smart enough to know how it worked. Surely enough, I heard the dog food being eaten after the shuffling of 4 limbs going against the hardwood floor. With even more questions rushing through my head, I continued my journey when a creak from the floor underneath my feet sounded the animal. The food stopped moving and then once again silence flooded the house. Then a shadow slowly made its way to the opening of the hallway and stopped just before it could be seen. Frozen with fear and curiosity, I waited with the hope that if it looked down maybe it couldn't make out my surroundings. The shadow stayed there for a bit, then once again crept forward as I could begin to hear the slight breathing of the animal just on the other side of the wall. Out of the darkness, I could make out the end of a dog's snout as I started to hear it sniff. I slowly started to lean to try and catch a better glimpse, but within a second it loudly ran to the doggy door. With a tired reaction time, I started to run to the opening just to see the doggy door closing back from the intruder. I ran to the door and opened it, but there was nothing but the cold breeze to greet me to the night. Turning back to look for any clues, I saw just as I thought that a noticeable amount of food had been eaten and the smell was still slightly present from where the dog had been. I went to examine the kitchen and was presented with a steaming pile of feces left in the middle of the floor. Disgusted with the sight, I went to grab some materials to clean it up when I realized something odd. The shit was large, too large for a dog. Apollo had been a large dog and I had to clean up after him for 12 long years, but this was something else. Everything I had heard pointed towards it was a dog, but the human-sized feces confused me and creeped me out. Seeing that it was very late, I decided to ignore the strange sight and clean up, making sure everything was locked, and getting back to my bed. This time I made sure to place a nearby box against the doggy door to make sure that whatever it was could not enter again. Though sleep was rough that night, I managed to get a little sleep in with the extra protection of the box that served as a barrier for my safety and the dog outside. The next couple of days consisted of me trying to find explanations for the weird events of the nights before. How could Apollo be back? Was it truly him? Did something find a way to get inside? Maybe it was the deep hope of seeing my best friend again, but I knew that it wasn't possible. I saw his lifeless body on that floor, I threw the dirt on the dog that I once played with, and I watched as the foggy eyes of my best friend were covered by the cold earth. The days consisted of me asking the same questions, and the nights added more confusion to my life. I would go to sleep with my door closed, wondering if the intruder would come back in and make its visit, and it would take some time to fall into sleep. A single creak would wake me up, and sometimes I swear I could hear it back in my house. Some mornings I would notice the box was slightly pushed forward as if something was trying to get in, or that it had pushed it back into place so it would look normal. The thought of it being in my house as I slept never went right with my mind. Things seemed to slowly get back to normal, and just as always, the dreams began to come back with the same waking nightmare. I wish things had stayed that way. Getting back to my routine felt somewhat nice and brought some joy to my life that I hadn't felt in a long time. I came back to my house and sat on my couch with time to relax before the night was ready to take charge. With a little boost of joy, I decided to make my favorite meal and turn on my favorite movie. The day was the best one I had experienced since the last time I saw Apollo. After eating, I went to wash the dishes and stared into the backyard, thinking of how my friend was back there, resting, and hopefully at peace. I never looked back there since it only brought sadness to me, but maybe I could start thinking of it as a happy reminder of the good memories instead of the bad ones I had made recently. It was cold outside, and to be quite honest, ever since the dog in the house, it creeped me out to go outside at night. I went to the light switch and flipped on the outside lights to get a view of the grave to maybe give me some good closure to end the day off. My eyes tried to adjust to the harsh darkness of the night when I noticed a small pile of dirt beside the grave. Pure fear engulfed my very presence and I tried my best to understand. I ran outside the back door and to the grave sweating. There it was, the once-free grave with now nothing but earthworms at the once-occupied space of Apollo. I had to have been in some nightmare, some long and descriptive nightmare made up in my fucked-up head. The sweat dripped from my forehead and was caught by my nose, which made the sweat run to my lips. Was Apollo alive? Was he some kind of demon haunting me? There were no signs of a shovel but only the marks of paws or hands that formed the pile of dirt beside the grave. I had no idea when this had been done, but I wish I would have simply looked out sooner. Whatever was in my house was either some demented version of Apollo or something that had dug up his remains. Either way, I was terrified. The most gut-wrenching thing about the situation was that after looking around there was no sign of Apollo's remains anywhere. I ran back into my house and slammed the door shut, panting and sweating with every possible thought clouding my mind. What I once thought was my dog now was something else, and it had been in my house with me. As far as I knew, it had been coming in when I wasn't even aware. Sleep was not even an option now, and I stood there thinking of how anything that had happened could be real. That was when the sound of a whimper made my blood turn cold. Everything in my body seemed to pause when I heard the quiet whimper of a dog, or something that sounded similar to one, from in the distance. I slowly lifted my head to face the hallway when I was met with the sight of half a human face staring back at me. I could tell by his height he was on all fours and was hidden behind the wall where only half of his face was showing. On his head was what I could only make out as the skull of Apollo, with bits of his rotten flesh still holding onto the skull. The sockets were empty where the man's eyes could see through all the flesh, and he looked at me with a frown while still making a whimpering sound. Flies orbited him and the smell slowly crept towards me, just as bad as how it smelled the night before. Sensing the look of disgust and horror on my face, he quickly darted into the hall with the loud bash of his knees and palms smacking the floor. My heart bounded and my knees felt weak as I had to grab the counter to help hold up my weight. This man had been in my house, at my door, acting like my dog, and he desecrated my dog's grave. I wanted to vomit at the thought of a man drooling on my floor and wearing my dog's rotting skin running through my house just 10 feet away from me. I wasn't sure what sick game this man was playing or what mental state he was in, but my body refused to move. He had found this collar which led him directly into my house and acted as if he was my dog, my only friend, and found some sick pleasure in it. A scratching began to echo into the kitchen, and with what must have been pure adrenaline I began to walk to the doorframe as if I had just learned to move my legs. I finally made it to the door frame when I saw the twisted figure of the man scratching at my door. He was propped up on his knees and clawing at the door to my bedroom painting, drool coming from his tongue and forming a puddle of slimy liquid on the floor. I could see the collar around his neck, tight and making his veins pop out from his neck. His body was dirty and he was hairy. He was naked, and near his rear had the decaying tail of Apollo stapled to his back. Clumps of feces could be seen stuck in his hair, and each one of his nails were long. It was the most disgusting sight I had ever laid my eyes on, and it took all my strength to not throw up on the floor in front of me. After looking at him for a couple of seconds, he faced me and barked. He began to shake his rear to simulate the wagging of the tail stapled on him, and through it, all just stared at me. I had never seen such a human that had such features as a dog, yet there he was. Staring at him made it difficult to remember that this was a man, a grown man, acting like a dog. There was no telling how long he had been doing this, and he could have been here for weeks, watching me. I wanted him out of my house, I wanted to run him out, but this wasn't a dog. He was a full-grown man that could overtake me, and I needed a way to protect myself. I didn't have a gun, and the only thing I had remotely to a weapon was a kitchen knife, but I couldn't just take my eyes off him. Now that I had seen him, what would he do? He looked at me with such innocence. He reminded me of the way Apollo used to look at me. The man just stared at me, watching, waiting, and I did the same. The only plan I had was to run to the kitchen and get the knife, Anything after that would have to be determined by what the man did. The only issue is that if I approached him in the hallway he could easily overpower me. I would have to distract him. Swallowing all the disgust, I decided the only possible solution was to play along with his little game. "Hey buddy," I said after whistling towards him, "are you lost?" The man at the end of the hallway tilted his head with curiosity and responded with a deep bark that was so realistic it sent a shiver through my bloodstream. Looking around the area, I saw an old bone of Apollo's and quickly picked it up, showing it off to him. "Here buddy. I know you must be scared, but we can play now. Come on." After patting my knees to gesture to him to come, he slowly crawled through the hallway towards me. Slowly creeping back to make sure to stay out of his range, I continued to whistle and wave the bone at him. Watching the man come closer terrified me as the sound of his heavy breathing grew louder and louder with each thud of his knees to the hardwood. Now just a couple feet away from me, I threw the bone as he tracked it and started to quickly shuffle to it. In an instant, I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife. As I ran I could hear the man quietly giggling, trying to pick up the bone with his teeth. Just as soon as I pulled the knife from the counter I ran back into the living room to see him turned away from me with only the sight of his hairy back, the tail which dangled from scabies of blood from where the staple had punctured his skin. Without hesitation, I held the knife and with as much force as possible launched it into his back. With a loud yelp, he dropped the bone and crawled to the doggy door. Once again I ran towards him and punctured the knife into his flesh multiple times as blood began to splat and ooze out of his dirt-covered body. Nothing but adrenaline pumped through my body as I kept stabbing and stabbing while he attempted to crawl out of the door. With all my strength I flipped him over and began to stab his chest and guts to make sure that I would end it for good. All those nights of fear rushed into me and drove my anger, which led to more push into each stab. Blood began to shoot out of his mouth and the once innocent eyes were now filled with terror and the realization of death. I finally stopped and stood up, looking as he lay there shaking and gasping for breath against the amount of blood seeping into his lungs. "What the hell are you?" I asked, staring into his terrorized eyes. "Your best friend. I wanted to be a good boy," he wheezed. I stared back at him for a second and wrapped my hands tight around the knife to give the final blow. "My best friend is gone, and you sure as hell are not him." Within a second I dug the knife deep into his chest until nothing but my breathing remained in the room. The nightmare was over. I got up and called the police, and they were just as confused as I was. They asked the same questions I had no answer to as we looked at the corpse of the man who once sat at my door waiting for some sick reward. To this day I am not sure of what made him do this or how long he was there. The dreams never stopped after everything, and every other night I still see my best friend in my dreams and I miss him. Life is hard without Apollo and my parents, and I would do anything to see them again. I wish those dreams could become a reality, but at the same time, from the reality I witnessed these past days, I'll stick with the dreams. And so, we come to the end of our terrifying journey inside the haunted house, where horror and mystery intertwine in an unforgettable story. If you enjoyed this chilling experience and want to see more thrilling videos, don't forget to hit the like button to support us and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with all our new content. And make sure to turn on the notification bell so you're the first to watch our upcoming stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon in a new adventure. Until then, remember, sometimes the truth is scarier than fiction. See you next time, end quote.